Hello everyone and welcome to this episode, the event management one of the Women Talking About Learning podcast. I'm Andrew Jacobs. We all know what it's like to attend an event, whether it be online, a conference, exhibitions, and have an enjoyable experience. But have you ever thought about what it takes to plan, arrange and manage these events? With this in mind, we've two expert women talking about event management. Our first guest is Laura Watkin. Laura's passion and expertise is the science of learning and people development, and she's passionate about evidence-informed learning. Laura is Principal Pedagogy Lead for the UK charity Frontline and is responsible for the quality of teaching and learning for a master's level qualifying programme. Alongside this, she's the co-creator of the ASRI model for learning design and delivery, working as part of the Be More Learning and Development Limited. Our second guest is Dolores Gott, and a second-time guest on the podcast. A self-proclaimed resident nerd, she has a diverse career history, including roles as a figure skating coach, facility manager, customer service trainer, event manager, graphic designer, and marketing specialist. Currently a senior training specialist for Cognizant, Dolores volunteers as a co-organiser for the GLDC, an online L&D networking group. She holds an MBA, a BBA in marketing, and a BA in psychology from Southern Methodist University. This episode was recorded in April 2024. This is Women Talking About Learning. This is Laura and Dolores talking about event management.
Well, hi Laura, how are you?
Hi Dolores, I'm really good. Absolutely brilliant today. How are you doing?
Oh, really, really good. Thank you for asking. So we're here to talk about, events and how events kind of tie into learning and development here. So I'm just really curious about this topic and how the two really are complementary to one another. If I may, I had a background in event management before I went into learning and development. And so I always kind of had this influence of running my learnings as events, but I'm really curious to see other people interpret this connection. So what do you think, Laura? What are your connections?
The point that you've made me think already is just the definition of event. So just by you talking about that connection between learning as an event, but actually, I think it's really interesting to think, well, what does that mean? What do we think of when somebody mentions the word event and this title of event management? Because I think I would always naturally go for an in-person conference style image comes to mind. But the reason I was drawn to this topic is because actually, similar to what you've mentioned, a lot of the things that I seem to be involved in is much more varied now. That an event can be, and certainly in the learning space, it might be an online event. It might be something pre-recorded. It might be a combination of all of those things. It could be something in person. And I think the variety of things that constitute an event, particularly in the learning space, has grown dramatically and certainly in recent times. So I think that point is so relevant. And I guess I wondered if you had anything particular that really brought you to this topic. Like, is there something specific that you perhaps have learnt about in recent times that's kind of affected your view of what constitutes an event?
Yeah, so it's odd that you mentioned that because I mentioned that I was an event planner before I was in learning and development, and I remember my first job in learning and development, I was doing onboarding for a company, and I thought, oh my gosh, well, this is essentially, putting together an event. There's admin work, there's behind the scenes work, there's plan A, plan B, plan C in case something doesn't go right. So there was a lot of things that just kind of aligned with each other. And then I came across a book by Priya Parker called The Art of Gathering. I devoured that book, and it really tied together, the things that I wanted out of training, and it married really well with my experience in events. So it's also kind of interesting to think about because every single type of training requires different things, right? So, your online training or your online asynchronous training requires something different than an online synchronous training, or a live training requires something different than like a job aid, right? So like all of those things just kind of tie in together. What do you think?
I completely agree in that there are some elements that are common to no matter what the format is. And I think that when you're talking about, the idea of gathering, bringing people together, I think one of the factors that's common, regardless of how you're trying to design or deliver an event, is being really sort of focused on why are we doing it? Why are we bringing, if I think about event as bringing people together in some way, like you say, that could be, they might be working in a self-directed manner, but we're basically creating a space for something to happen. And I think certainly what comes to mind first is why are we doing it? Like being very outcomes led. What is it we're trying to do? What are we trying to achieve? And how do we, what do we want people to go away with at the end of it? What should they hopefully have got from this experience? And I think that's really common. And I think what I've learned more and more is that there's also a lot of elements that are really unique to the individual formats. And certainly something that has been on my mind a lot is just that real importance of knowing your audience. So, who are the people that you're bringing together, and what are they looking for? What are they expecting? And I think there's this balance between what we might want to plan and the control and direction and power we have to influence an event, but really thinking about, well, what are the people that are coming to this event wanting from it? And how is that a two-way interaction? How is that going to be a real collaborative experience? Because I think if you're not careful, certainly I think in my earlier career, I fell into that trap of feeling like I have to be responsible for every single element. So I have to plan everything. I need to be in control of everything. It's our event. And somewhere down the line, there are some people that are going to turn up and interact with it. But I think I've kind of flipped it on its head now and more think about, right, what do these people want to get out of it? How are they going to experience it? And so I think that's been a real shift in my approach to events, is being much more centered around whether you want to call them a learner, a participant, an attendee, whatever their sort of label is, very much thinking about it from the experience of the person that's coming, rather than all the task list of jobs that I need to do. And I guess when you mentioned being an event planner, I wondered if any of that resonated with your experiences.
Oh, for sure. Like I'm already thinking of like different things to tackle on this subject. So like for instance, I love the idea of, we're bringing everyone together for a common goal, right? And in learning and development, generally that's learning something or practicing a skill or, sharing knowledge with one another, especially in like conferences and whatnot. I'm also thinking of the ways that we make space for underrepresented communities in events. So one of the things that I was really conscious of working in a historic building is, ADA compliance. There's so many things that we needed to make sure that everyone had, so that the building was accessible and therefore that the event was accessible for everyone. Yeah. And I think like the last part of that I'm honestly trying to remember, the caffeine is still trying to to hit in. I think the other part about events too is just tying everything together. And once you plan enough, you just kind of have to know when to let go. And as a recovering perfectionist, that's been the life lesson that that's been the lesson that life has been trying to teach me is as a recovering perfectionist, you can plan as much as you want and then you just let it go.
The point you make about like perfectionism is really interesting, because when I was thinking about one of the prompts for this conversation is how might women be affected in this space? And one of the first things that came to mind is, is a generalization, but, is it true that actually women tend towards these sort of, this kind of perfectionist nature of wanting to get everything done? But also it made me think, are women seen as natural organizers, planners? Do we end up in the roles where we do a lot of the doing, whether that's because of, sort of the maternal stereotypes, and how that perhaps ends up with a lot of women in event spaces, perhaps working outside of the scope of the role that they're there for, because actually they take on or are given more of the, well, actually, you're great at the organizing, the planning. So actually we'll let you do all of that bit. You know, and I think that's really interesting. But also what you said about a moment ago about caffeine, because by accent, I'm based in the UK. So here it's 3:20 in the afternoon as we're recording this. But what about for yourself? Because obviously timing, if you're working with a global audience, can make a huge difference to how people experience events. So yeah, like whereabouts are you located and what time is it?
So I'm located in the central time zone of the United States in Texas, and it is about 9:22 a.m. as we're recording this. But yeah, in my job, I do work with a global audience, and that's something that I have to keep in mind is, if the purpose of this training, if the purpose of this particular resource is to inform or to educate, then I have to really keep in mind, who's going to be consuming it and at what point in time. And is this a one shot only consumption, or is this something that they can refer back to whenever they need it? So that definitely comes in mind.
Yeah, definitely. And I think having had some recent experience working with global audiences, it was a huge amount of learning from all sorts of different angles. And you were mentioning accessibility in a physical venue. And I think it's something that's become rightly much more prominent and much more considered more overtly as accessibility more broadly. And I think there's a few things that I know that I'm now thinking about more consciously in relation to accessibility. So my background is learning and education. So I've always had an eye on things like, accessibility of language and digital accessibility of materials, making sure they're accessible for screen readers, etc. And that kind. But actually what I've thought more about recently is both from what we were talking about in terms of things like time zones, people's preferences for working at different times. I think, again, thinking about women in particular, how does this interact with things like often being childcare, or primary caregivers, and I've had some brilliant experiences where I've been to in-person events where actually they've facilitated a creche as part of the event and got sponsorship to make that freely available, which I thought was fantastic. So whether we're talking about a female parent or not, at least, it makes it that one step more accessible. But to your point about, timings and everything else, I haven't gone back to look at it, but I'm very conscious that a book that I've really enjoyed reading is When by Daniel Pink. A lot of the research about how we work differently at different times of the day, for example. But also I've just got hold of a copy of Invisible Women and the absence of women in research. And I need to go back and almost sort of perhaps interrogate further some of the research and some of the thinking around why and how we work better at different times of day, alongside are women represented within that research? Because I think, when you're planning events for a global audience, you may have no choice about what time of day you're putting something on, or you might have to think really carefully about what's the right time to try and minimize the impact on people who are joining from quite varied time zones.
Yes. Oh my gosh. And so, I mean, now I've got 2 books to read on holiday. So I'm very excited about that.
You've given me one as well. So that book list my bookshelf is going to get even heavier.
Oh, I love it. I do love a good bookshelf. I do love a good Sudoku or not Sundoku moment there. But yeah, so you mentioned what's essentially a circadian rhythm, right? So you're trying to figure out when your brain is most apt to focus on a particular task, or when you're most likely to work. So taking, for instance, the differences between me and my husband. I'm a huge early bird. Like I can get up at 6 a.m. and start working and focusing on the most complicated things. And then by around 11 a.m., my brain starts kind of sunsetting a little bit. And then I'm basically useless between, until about 2 o'clock in the afternoon. And then I get a second shot of focus time at 3 o'clock. So really my work day kind of starts at 6:30 and then it pauses at 11. And then then resumes again around 2:30, and it goes until 6. So for me, I've got that midday slump. For my husband, he is basically in a slump until about 5 o'clock in the afternoon, and then his brain is in really, really sharp focus mode until about 12 a.m., 1 a.m. at night. Like he's the complete opposite of me. And I bring that up because, I feel like since the pandemic, it's become a lot more accepted to figure out your own schedule, especially if you work remotely. And I think that's a huge, unfortunately, it's a privilege when it really should be a right to be able to figure out, like, when do you work best? When do you feel like you have the best potential to do something? And so that's something that I try to put forth in my work. Is I want to make sure that this is accessible to you when you are ready to access it.
I think that's such an important point, and also a real challenge, because actually there are limitations when you're planning any kind of event, and there's always parameters you're having to work within. And I think one of the things that, again, I've become much more aware of and try and sort of promote a lot more is, if you're planning any length of event, I guess probably because my background is quite a lot in the learning sciences, how are you thinking about that cognitive load? I loved what you said about that sunset moment, and that difference in energy levels, ability to pay attention. And I think one of the things that is done quite a lot at some of the bigger events that last, a whole day, for example, or over multiple days, is providing a lot of choice. So people can choose to dip in and out of different sessions, but that choice can also be overwhelming. And I certainly find if I go to an all-day event that I definitely reach a point where I'm like, that's it. My cognitive load is reached. I've taken in as much as I can take in. And so one thing I try and really promote is, where are we creating breathing spaces? We have to have time to process information. And when you said about the accessibility, I think there's a lot to think about in terms of, can we release any materials in advance so that people can have more time to process what's coming? Can we build in more pause points in the day? I think we're really good at thinking about the transmission of information, creating the right space for people to share content. But I think there's less events where I see really good examples of space for processing, space for kind of discussing and making sense of what's going on. And I think a lot of events almost like leave that work to the breaks and the lunches. But it's not always that you're at events with people that you know. And so actually, I think more sessions, more events could just sort of check themselves a little bit more to say, have we created enough space for questions, for discussion, for that time just to be prompted to go, what have I taken away from this? What does it mean for me? So that's something I'm definitely thinking about. And I have just seen that Andrew's posted us a bit of a sort of query around this point we talked about earlier about women at events. So I'm keen to ask you the question he's shared with us and see what you think about, how far do you agree that women are behind the scenes more at events?
I have to admit, when it comes to learning and development events, I haven't been to as many. Most of mine have been remote events or digital events, but I have noticed a little bit of a trend to where it's more male speakers and more women who are behind the scenes, who are doing who are doing producing, who are doing marketing, who are doing all of the behind the scenes things. So I think that's always kind of really interesting. And when I was getting started in my career, I was thinking to myself, like, I don't know anything. No one's going to want to hear anything from me. I'm still figuring out. I'm still very much figuring it out. But luckily, thanks to people like Andrew who make space for people and say, like, no, you've got stuff to say. Like that's been a really, really good push for me. And it's been a really good moment of growth for me. And it's something that I've kind of adopted and wanted to focus on whenever I'm in these events, because I see so many women who just kind of they're very comfortable in their realm, and they have really good ideas that need to be shared, but they don't have the confidence there yet. And so, yeah, I've been trying to take a page from Andrew and make space for women who, really, really need to spread their wings, so to speak.
Yeah, I'd agree with you that there could definitely be a trend where the organisers, Andrew can choose to edit this part out, that we've learned that actually the organiser, the administration skill set behind this podcast is led by a female. But I guess what I have seen is more events being more deliberate about the fact that there's good representation, that there is as much diversity across all sorts of different social graces, within those panels, audiences, sessions. But I also agree with you that spaces like this, where it's, again, a deliberate invitation for women's voices, are absolutely crucial. And I think there's been a lot of discussion, sort of social media content around imposter syndrome and, like you say, this confidence, and it does seem to always be aligned with women. And I'm really sort of challenging myself to think, are we perpetuating a stereotype in those conversations, or is it actually, an important sort of truth that we need support to overcome, or a bit of both? And yeah. I think that, in answer to the question about sort of women behind the scenes, I am thinking back to some recent events that I've been to, and in those events, it's probably a good representation, but if I had to count, I'd probably say there were more men, and certainly giving the bigger keynotes, the sort of more prominent sessions. But I do think that very much depends on the sector in which you work. So I think I think there is an element where, there's a good effort to make sure that there's a balance, but perhaps it shouldn't be so hard. Perhaps it shouldn't have to be so deliberate. Even as I'm saying it, I'm like, why am I thinking that, if I was looking for a panel, why am I thinking I should have to work hard to make sure that there is really good representation? Why does that feel more difficult? So, yeah. But I wonder, I guess I'm also curious, like, going back to, I guess, audiences and preferences and context, is there anything specific to any context you work in that, again, I'm thinking about the different locations and cultures that we work in. Is there anything that you would want perhaps people to know about organising events for perhaps your native audience,
Oh, God, that's a really good question. Kind of hard to answer too, because I feel like my native audiences are, so I oversee 3 areas of the world in terms of training. So I oversee North America, so the US and Canada, and then Latin America. And being bilingual in Spanish, it's been a real challenge and like a love to be able to bring up Latin America to an organization and to a team that didn't usually think about it. Usually Latin America was an afterthought. And so a lot of times language tends to be the one that I go after, because I always grew up hearing "say what you mean." And I do say what I mean, or at least I think I do, but a lot of times the impact is different than the intent. And I think back to a situation where we had a recruiter evaluate a candidate, and the recruiter used the word aggressive when they meant assertive. And I read the sentence in Spanish, and then I said, no, it's not aggressive. The word that they're trying to use is assertive. And that changed the entire feel and the entire vibe of the whole interaction. So I think it's really important to approach audiences with a positive intent, and know that sometimes that happens. Sometimes people misspeak or they say something that they didn't mean to, and it's important for us to recognize that and approach things with positive intent.
Yeah, I think the point you make about language is so relevant, and actually not necessarily just for different language speakers and different global audiences, but just because there are so many words that will automatically have different interpretations. People's own prior knowledge and experience is going to lead them to a different realm of thought. Like we mentioned at the beginning, mention the word event and it will conjure up all sorts of different images for different people. So yeah, I think I do think that is such an important consideration about, again, are we really thoughtful about, how we're presenting information, how clear we're being, how much we're clarifying, what we mean, what we say. And again, I guess if you create a lot of space for that two-way interaction, then at least you know what you've said, but it's just so important to hear what others have interpreted. What are you thinking as a result of what I've shared? Have you got the same understanding as me? But you're right, when it comes to people also having to translate information, because a lot of events are presented in English as a standard language, but you might have many people attending where it might be their second or third language. And no matter how fluent they are, to your point, they absolutely would benefit from that space to have that discussion. And I've certainly worked in situations where we've actually done breakout spaces based on language preference to allow people, because obviously there's an extra layer of processing, isn't there, where you're having to translate to your native language. You might be wanting to think in your native language, then you're translating back to give an answer. And to your point, you're then having to think really carefully about what vocabulary you're using. So yeah, we've absolutely organised event spaces, breakout spaces based on language preferences, and then used the benefits of the strongest speakers to then feed back on behalf of the group in the target audience. So that's really helpful.
Yeah. And if you're like me, there are some days where I feel like I'm speaking Spanish better and I think in Spanish, and other days where I'm, speaking English better and I'm thinking in English. And so it just kind of depends on what the day brings,
Absolutely. And I'm like, you having the option or choice to move between those two things to whatever.
I don't know how much of it is optional sometimes.
Yeah, maybe not so optional. Yeah, my sister lives in Spain and and spends 99% of her time speaking Spanish. So yeah, similarly does a lot of translating backwards and forwards. But it's hard work, isn't it? It's that, I guess it's that consideration of what is going on for people that might make engaging in an event more challenging. And it's just that kind of awareness, isn't it, of what people might be having to manage and deal with in order to, whether it's to get to an event, if it's physical in person, to access it. We've talked about the time of the day, but yeah, there could be all sorts of things going on. And I think you made a point earlier about, that sort of circadian rhythm. And we've talked about some of the challenges, I think, particularly for women. And certainly I think something that is rightly being talked more about is even things like the impact of the menopause. How is that impacting people's ability, the realities of fatigue and brain fog, and the impact of, treatments they might be taking or don't have access to support them through that period of their lives. And I think,
or even just the day-to-day mental load.
So, when you're thinking about adding, making sure that any event you've got is as accessible as possible, there are so many things. And it drew me to, when you think about some of the increased awareness of adult diagnoses of neurodivergence, there's a lot of kind of sense and information that actually women are very good at masking, have become very good at coping strategies. Yes. And masking those, the difference in neurodiversity. So again, I think if we're planning events, being as mindful as possible of how do we provide choice? How do we provide flexibility? Mm-hmm. How do we really think about that audience and how they are most likely to engage with the event of whatever form it takes? And when you were mentioning earlier about, asynchronous content, content that you can use in a much more self-directed way at your own time, I think that's really helpful. So I think I mentioned, quite a few events are really good at sharing materials afterwards, but being able to share more up front can really benefit, a lot of individuals.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I'm a big processor, and it takes me a few rounds to look at information and think about it and internalize it to really start applying it. And so I also try to bring that to my trainings as well. But I had a question here that I really want to ask you. So we talked a little bit about how the definition of events kind of varies based on the person. So I want to ask you, if you think of learning as an event, what do you think of? What's the imagery in your mind?
I actually found it really challenging to think of learning as an event, because when I think of an event, I do think of it like a one-off thing, because I guess that's been my sort of historical experience that, yeah, event is a thing. And so from a learning perspective, it would be a series of events. It's a whole sequence and series of different types of things that come together. So yeah, lots of individual events along a journey. And that's very much how I see it. And I do think that there seems to be a much greater understanding of the importance of variety and sequencing and spacing of events along a learning journey, that it isn't good enough to just have this one thing, this upfront thing, because actually, you can tick the box and say, yes, we put on this event, we provided this information, or we gave this training, and ta-da, everything is now fixed. Everybody's learned everything and we've done it, and I just think it's really interesting that you asked that question. It's such a good question, because my immediate thought of what an event is so in conflict with actually learning as an event, because it's the exact opposite. It's everything I do is to drive towards that long-term learning journey process and building in that repetition, revisiting, sequencing learning over time to help people move from a position where they've encountered something new, they've had chance to make sense of it, we've brought it back and revisited it over time, but most importantly, they've had the opportunity to put it into practice and to get some feedback and to apply something and see how it works in their own context. And that's the learning part, isn't it? Is the behavior change that happens as a result of whatever you've encountered. So yeah, that was a great question. But same goes back to you. Like, what's your relationship between event and learning?
Yeah, it's kind of funny that because in my mind, it's disconnected, because on one hand, when I think of learning as an event or events as learning, I think of the person on stage with all the lights, and it's like the TED Talk type of thing, and the audience is there and they're dark and they're the ones, it's like a one-way interaction, right? But as a person, I don't think like that. Like, to me, I'm an introvert and I need decompression time. So for me, my best learning time is, alone at home, total quiet, or maybe I've got some music in the background and I have several instances of learning. So I'll read 15 minutes here, 15 minutes there. I'll talk about it with a friend, and then I'll go back and read again. So yeah, it's kind of interesting how the imagery, like the immediate imagery, is opposite to like what I actually practice.
And that is so true for me as well. And I wonder if that's where, if that stereotype is true for others, if that's where the challenge of planning really good learning comes from, is that we're still stuck in this cycle of seeing it as an event, a thing, a big deal. Whereas actually, like you say, the actual learning happens through all of that thinking we're doing, like you say, whether that's individually, independently, or processing that, having those conversations, just working through something and sense making it. And I agree with you that my work sounds very, very similar in approach to yours. Both of us very evidence informed in terms of that one event isn't the thing, and I think that's why I'm so keen on, when I do think about that stereotypical, normally in person or online live event, is building in more of those spaces for people to step away, digest, and, and I appreciate there's a real pressure that if you have and often spent a lot of money, hiring a venue, bringing people together, bringing together speakers, then people want to speak. They want to share what they know. And it isn't always comfortable, but I think we can give more permission to having like the sorts of sessions at events that are more facilitative, that get people facilitating and giving people a chance to speak. I think one of the most fascinating styles of events are unconferences, where there isn't an agenda, there isn't a set of speakers, and it's actually the audience, the attendees, that create the conference themes and topics by the very nature of them turning up. And I think that's something that perhaps doesn't happen enough. And maybe it's that fear of controlling events again as well, that we feel like we need to have it all buttoned up, that it's a bit risky to just say, hey, we've got no agenda, we've got no topics, we're going to create it as we go. And I think you've got to be quite brave to set it up, but it's amazing how successfully it can happen.
Yeah, I call them office hours, but that's probably my background in higher education speaking there. But yes, so I actually have a few trainings coming up where I'm going to be facilitating the sharing of information to my audiences, and then I'm going to have an office hours afterwards to allow them time to sit and reflect, listen to other people's questions, and then maybe come up with their own questions as well. But I've never heard that term unconferences before, but I really love it.
It's a really brilliant concept. I'm not sure exactly where it came from, but yeah, it's something it's well worth having a look at if it's something new. But yeah, it's very much about having no structure, no agenda, not no structure, but no set agenda, and you create it as a group. So there is quite a lot of structure. There's quite a lot of kind of, sort of great practice in how to do it really well. But it just means that particularly where you've got bringing together an audience that do have experience, it means that the event you're creating cannot fail to be relevant, because the people attending are the ones saying, I really want to talk to you about this, or this is my challenge, and I really want some ideas on how we might solve that, or this is what's of interest to me right now, and I want to hear what others are experiencing in their context that I might learn from. So again, anything that creates a two-way interaction, I think always brings real benefit. But I think the prompt we've just been given, is it because our sponsors expect an event? I think that goes back to some of the core challenges of learning and development, the tick sheets, the attendance sheets, absolutely that. Yeah, it's down to all of us working in this space to help the people that are sponsoring events to really understand where we might want to do things differently and where the value is of doing that. I think, again, going back to what I said at the beginning, that there's going to be an expectation from your audience, but that doesn't mean you have to feed into previous stereotypes. You can create spaces that are really different.
I feel like that's something that we struggle with we encounter in learning and development so much, where you have a stakeholder saying, I want this result. And then you, as the learning expert, come in and say, this is how you can get that result. And a lot of times the stakeholders are like, oh no, that's not the way I would do it. I'm like, oh, okay, well, I'm so glad you're the learning expert now. But yeah, I mean that was a little bit of my sassy nature. I'm very sassy in my head, but I do try to advocate for my learners with my stakeholders. And I try to tell them, okay, well, this is the logic behind this. If you're trying to get a change in behavior, if you're trying to get adoption of a system or a tool or something, this is what you need to do in order to get to that result. And that almost becomes like an event. Like the intake of that conversation almost becomes like an event.
I agree with you. And I think that it brings me back to this, the fact that we just need to be really outcomes led. And I think if you can bring people back to what is it you actually want to achieve? What's the change you're looking for? And for a lot of people, when it's businesses, it is very much about the return on investment. It's about what KPIs are we trying to move? And I think if you can keep the conversation focused on what is it that you really want people to be doing differently or thinking differently as a result, then to your point, sharing that rationale around, okay, so, and doing it from a very risk management perspective. So, okay, we could do X. That's what you'd like to do. We will put on this big flashy event. And I think it's also our responsibility to understand why the event, what else does that mean for you? What's important? Is it important to be able to showcase a big event? And that's important maybe for the company's profile and status. But then if we go back to, so what is it we want people to actually feel or do differently? And like you say, if we share that rationale as we go, I do think that is a way into saying, to bringing it from this point of view of, if we do it that way, there's these risks. We can manage those risks in these ways. And sometimes the ways that we can manage the risks allows us to then suggest alternatives. It creates this risk. So how about we take it down this route instead? So yeah, we could have 14 keynote speakers, all of your top people come and present one after the other. There's a big risk that people are going to get overloaded and overwhelmed. So we could have, say, 7 of those people and have a space after each one to have Q&A, to discuss, to digest, and give people some time to reflect. So I think there's a way of achieving expectations of the people that commission events and make sure we get the learning goals as a result. But I do think there's an underestimation of how long that can take and the time needed, the investment needed in setting all that up.
Yeah. And I will say, I've actually just remembered a conversation that I had with a stakeholder where instead of just telling them outright what the risks were, I asked them Socratic questions about, if we went down this way, what do you think would happen? And they kind of came to the conclusion that I was trying to get them to go to the entire time. And that's that little facilitator trick, is know your audience, know what is their headache, try to be like the aspirin to their headache, so to speak. And that's how you build trust. And I feel like with stakeholders, if you build that trust and you tell them, I think we got to do it this way, it's a lot more likely that they're just going to believe you and let you, operate in your realm of genius.
Absolutely. And I think the more that certainly what I'm taking away from this conversation is keeping in mind, what are people thinking about when we're talking about events, and almost like following my own, the stuff that I share with everybody else about, I know what I think an event is, and I know that it doesn't match with what I want to, with sort of learning as an event. So I've got to be very mindful of that with other people. So that is something that will definitely stick with me as a result of this conversation, is just that checking in, what are we even on the same page before we start about what we mean by this particular event that we're planning.
For sure. I think my takeaway from this conversation is knowing that a lot more people think of learning as events than I originally thought, which is fantastic. And if you come to the table with a common goal and you just kind of keep in mind everyone's ways that they want to reach the goal, I think it just elevates that journey a lot more.
Absolutely. And most importantly, we can also make it fun,
Oh, yes.
It's okay to still have a nice time as well. Yeah.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah. No, I've so much enjoyed talking to you and hearing from your experience. Really appreciate it.
Same here. Thank you so much, Laura. This has been fantastic.
No, thank you too. So much fun.
I love the conversation in this episode about how event management roles tend to be filled in by women. And Laura mentioned that this podcast, Women Talking About Learning, has brilliant admin and planning and great organisation. Simple reason why: it's done by a woman. All of that work is done by Natalie, who connects people and helps prepare the episodes. Laura asked, and reasonable question, is it because women are better at organising things? And we'd love to hear what you think. Please do let us know. An enormous thank you to Laura and Dolores for their time in recording this and giving us such super content. There are As always, tons of links in the show notes for this episode, along with contact details for both Laura and Dolores. And I also want to say thank you to Natalie for all of the work that she puts in to help prepare these episodes. Without them, these episodes wouldn't happen. We'll be back in a couple of weeks' time, and next time it's the inclusion and equality one. As always, thanks for listening, and we'll see you again soon.